In this demo, I'm going to show you how to, you can give things to NPCs or give something to an NPC and have them give you something back. It's pretty straightforward. So let's look at this project. I have a simple project. There's a computer lab. There's an object called Mr. Wright, and he's in the computer lab. There's a hallway to the south of the computer lab. Say if I go south, I end up in the hallway. Okay. There's a blank disk. Why don't I put the blank disk in the player's inventory? And there's a formatted boot disk, which is off screen, and maybe we'll play with that later. Let's make that portable. Let's make our blank disk portable. Ah, dogs barking. Sorry, hope you can't hear them. Okay, so let's say in this game, like let's do one example here where we're going to give something to an NPC, and it's just going to set a variable. Like we don't get anything back from the NPC. In the second example, we'll get something back from the NPC. So I'm going to make a function here called like give disk to, Mr. Wright, and click add. And then I'm going to right click here and let's see, NPCs, give something to an NPC. There we go. Give something to an NPC. Which object is the NPC? Mr. Wright. What am I going to give to Mr. Wright? I'm going to give the blank disk to Mr. Wright. There we go. And then it's going to ask me, would I like to add a sentence, give blank disk to Mr. Wright? And that sentence is going to call our function and say, yes, absolutely, we want to do that. Let's take a look at what we've got now. This is going to print the Mr. Wright says thank you. Okay, so we probably don't want it to do that. We can change this. Let's just say Mr. Wright says thank you. Okay, and then where's the blank disk now? We're going to put the blank disk inside of the Mr. Wright object, or we could move it off screen too, but this little snippet here is actually going to make the blank disk a child of Mr. Wright. Of that object. Now we won't be able to see it because the Mr. Wright object is not an open container, but it's like we can test whether Mr. Wright has the disk. We've also had a variable added to our game. It's called blank disk given, and that gets set to 1. So if we look at our variables, you'll see we now have a variable called blank disk given that starts off being 0, and when we give the blank disk to Mr. Wright, we're going to set that to a 1. So later in the game, like if we need to track, hey, did we give the disk to Mr. Wright yet? We can use this variable to test that. If this is 1, yes, we've given the disk to Mr. Wright. So let's test this out. So now I should be, and then let's look at our sentences here. You can say, now it says, okay, if I give the blank disk to Mr. Wright, call the give disk to Mr. Wright function. Let's run it. Okay, there's a Mr. Wright here. Okay, since I'm Mr. Wright, this is kind of awkward. Let's close this. Let's give Mr. Wright an initial description. You'll see how this changes the game. Mr. Wright is standing here tinkering with his ancient computers. There, that's a much better description than there's a Mr. Wright here. So if you don't put in, I probably have to click off of there, okay. Not happy. Oh, because I put this on the blank disk. Mr. Wright, there you go. Hopefully you were watching that and you saw that train wreck in progress. There we go. It says, Mr. Wright is standing here tinkering with his ancient computers. Examine Mr. Wright is old and tired, but sporting a tie that no doubt has some computer science joke on it. Okay. Now, let's give blank to Mr. Wright. Now, you don't have to type out all the words. Oops. And of course, I was running in the debugger. There we go. And it says, Mr. Wright says, thank you. Cool. Now, let's look at our inventory. We are empty-handed. So we don't have the disk. Mr. Wright has the disk. And let's dump out our variables. I'm going to use the vars command, V-A-R-S, and that is going to dump out our variables. And you can see this blank disk given variable has been set to 1. So later in my game, I can test whether I've given the disc to Mr. Right. So when you give something to an NPC, the game is Lantern's going to give you a way to track if you've done that later. And you could also use that also for scoring. So to figure out if the player needs to get a certain number of points for that. Okay, now let's look at another example. I'm going to delete this code, and I'm going to add a different snippet. Let's add give something to an NPC and get something back. Let's try that. Which object is the NPC, Mr. Right? Which object do we give the player? The blank disk. What do we get back? A formatted boot disk. Would you like to add, we already have that sentence, so I'm just going to say no. And let's change our text. We'll say Mr. Right says thank you. Thank you. Formats the disk and gives it back to you. All right, now, and we probably want that to be a print line, print ln instead of print. So we have to, we don't, you're going to have to change the text in these things so it makes sense with your particular game. There's no way for the little wizard to know what you're trying to do in your game. So notice what it did here. It took the blank disk and it gave it to Mr. Right, and it took the formatted boot disk and it gave it to the player. It says the blank disk's location is Mr. Right. The formatted boot disk's location is the player. And now let's run this. Give blank to Right. Mr. Right says thank you, formats the disk and gives it back to you. Let's check our inventory. We are now carrying a formatted boot disk. So to the player, it seems like it's the same disk. We just got the same disk back, but it's really two separate objects. We did that switcheroo trick where we took something from the world and we moved it off screen, or we moved it somewhere else and moved a different object into the player's inventory. So it looks like it's the same object, except that it's actually not. The blank disk and the formatted boot disk are two completely separate disks. Let's see, what do we have for our variables here? Blank disk given is that's set to 0. Okay, so this did not, let me take a look at something real quick. Okay, I'm back. I closed Lantern and restarted it, and you'll see why. I made some changes to that snippet. So let's go to this give disk to Mr. Right function, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep that little bit of text there. I'm going to insert this snippet again, give an item to an NPC and get something back. Which object is the NPC? Mr. Right. What do we give the NPC? The blank disk. What do we get back? The formatted boot disk. And I'm going to say no because we already have that sentence. And what did you might be thinking, like, what did I change? This blank disk given, this second snippet was not setting that variable, but it does now. I fixed it, so yay. Now if I run my game, you can see blank disk given is set to 0. Give blank to Mr. Right says thank you, formats the disk and gives it back to you. I'm carrying a formatted boot disk, and if I type vars, you can see that blank disk given is now set to 1. So, so that is a, there we go. That's a way to give, there's demos of giving things to NPCs. There's all sorts of things you could do with this. With that first example, you could give a jug of wine to a guard, and then he drinks it and falls asleep, and then you replace that guard with a sleeping guard. You could, this is basically, or you bribe, you bribe somebody, you bribe a guard with something, you give him the money, and now when you try to go a particular direction, you can check that variable to see, like, if you should be allowed to go that way. So there it is. There's how to give stuff to NPCs.